everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our Bible study. We are in Luke chapter 17 today, progressing along nicely, and I woke up at like 4:30 a.m. this morning. Why? I have absolutely no idea, but I did. And so if all of this is nonsensical, that could very possibly be the reason. If you would like something that is sensical, well, here we go. If you would like something that is a little bit more sensible, you can get a copy of the notes. We have verse by verse notes, and you can get them down in the description. There's a bunch of links down there, and our Patreon page is down there if you want to support this channel. And we give away the notes for free as digital copies, so that everybody around the world can get them, and so your support helps to keep that and make it possible. All right, so we are picking up in chapter 17, verse 1. Let's read verses 1 and 2. And he, Jesus, said to his disciples, "Temptations to sin are sure to come, but woe to the one through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were cast into the sea, than that he should cause one of these little ones to sin." So Satan was and is at work in the world, and temptation is inevitable so long as God allows Satan to exist. Satan wants to pull people away from God. That seems to be like his sole focus for at least as far as what we know about him. And what are his tactics? Well, one of his tactics is tempting people to find satisfaction in something that's something other than God. Sometimes Satan does that through other people, using other people to tempt people. So some examples of that might look like, a friend peer pressures you to lie to get out of trouble. Someone dresses in a way that's meant to induce lust in an onlooker. Or maybe a coworker encourages a peer to skip family time to work overtime to get a promotion, to make their work their top priority. Jesus here very strongly condemned people who tempt other people into sin. He might have had the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the lawyers and the scribes in mind when he said this, because we know that they had some issues with this. The common Jews, they looked to those men as spiritual guides and looked to them for advice. They were like the little ones he mentions in the end of verse 2. Whoever causing one of these little ones to sin. So the common Jews, and they were kind of like those. I think he's just referring to basically his disciples there. Anyone who's trying to do what's right and to serve the Lord, and talks about how those who make those little ones stumble, they have really committed a great offense. But the common Jews were kind of like these people. They were looking to the Jewish religious leaders for guidance, and the religious leaders were causing them to stumble because they were leading them astray and they were putting forth a bad example. Jesus' language was pretty extreme here when you think about it. He told the people that it would be better for a person who tempts someone else to be dead rather than to continue coaxing other people to participate in those sins. He says it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he was to be cast into the sea. So the language is kind of shocking, but when you think about it, I mean, it does make sense. It would be better for a person to die and to go to hell than for that person to stay alive long enough to help other people go to hell with them. And if they're actively tempting other people, it's not only their soul that's in danger, but they're endangering other people's as well. It would be better for them just to be removed from the earth rather than to continue that process. So a millstone, probably, if you go to like a historical museum or site these days, you might see a millstone, but they're not used super commonly. Maybe in some developing countries around the world, but a millstone is basically just like, it's a heavy cut stone that's used to grind wheat at a mill. And sometimes it's it's spun by animals, donkeys, oxen that are tied up to a system, and they walk around in a circle and they grind the wheat under this big heavy stone. So as we think about this application, certainly it was applicable for the Pharisees and Sadducees and those guys, but we need to be thinking about this as well. What is my influence like? When people are around me, which way do I lead them? Am I leading other people into sin? Am I tempting other people? Am I doing the devil's work? We need to make our influence and our presence really an oasis for people, a place where it's easy to do the right thing, where we're steering people to godliness rather than sinfulness. Verse 3 through 4 now. Pay attention to yourselves. If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times in a day, and turns to you 7 times, saying, I repent, you must forgive him. We all need to pay attention to ourselves. That's what Jesus says at the very beginning of verse 3. Pay attention to yourselves! Exclamation point. We need to pay attention to ourselves so we don't lead other people into sin. It's easy to lead other people in the wrong direction because it's easy, and it comes very naturally for us to take the lazy route, the easy route, the sinful route, and to encourage other people to do the same thing, and to be lazy with our words and the things that we say. It's not hard to offend people with your words, and it's especially not very hard if you aren't careful with the words that you say and the actions that you take. A loose tongue is certainly the enemy of a good influence. And if we want to represent Christ well, we need to be giving constant care and thought to the way that we interact with people. The Christian life, it's not a lazy, reckless life. It's a considerate and a contemplative or contemplative. I don't know what the correct pronunciation is on that, but we need to be contemplating the way that our actions, our words, our influence is playing into somebody else's life. How is this affecting them? It's not just about ourselves. We're not living in a vacuum here. We are engaging with other people, and we need to pay attention to ourselves so that our influence is one that's godly. And this, when we look at this and think about it, it's not hard to see why God condemns the unsober mind or the drunken mind, whether that's on alcohol or by some other means, right? The mind that isn't in its right state. Because when you are not sober, then a lot of times you do things that you otherwise wouldn't. You say things that you otherwise wouldn't. And how many stories have you heard from people that weren't sober and said something that they regretted or did something that they regretted, and their influence was poor, and maybe they led other people into sin? Jesus says, pay attention to yourselves. I noticed something in verse 3 also that I hadn't necessarily noticed before, and it's that there's both forgiveness and rebuke commanded in this passage. Forgiveness is an often discussed Christian virtue, and we will discuss it in a moment, but we can't skip over the first part of Jesus' statement. Let me read that verse again. It says, if your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. Then Jesus talks a little bit more about forgiveness after that. So we often focus on the forgiveness, but we also need to take some time to recognize the first and shorter command, and that is the one to rebuke. Just as clearly as Jesus told his disciples to forgive, he told them to rebuke. And so they were to rebuke sin when they saw it in their brothers, in their fellow disciples. And I'll be the first to admit that I fail this a lot of times. It's sometimes easier just to laugh off somebody's sins or their bad actions, or to maybe feign like we pretend not to notice those things, or just kind of gloss over them, skip over them, because it's kind of awkward sometimes it's almost always awkward to confront somebody in their sins. But rebuking sin in somebody's life is just as loving as extending forgiveness to somebody. It shows that we care. It shows that we want that person to be in a right relationship with God, and that's the most loving thing we could possibly do. A person doesn't show any love for the soul of another person when they pretend that everything is all right and it's not. So just keep that in mind. People condemn rebuking others as basically as a sin these days. Like, how dare you rebuke somebody else? Jesus says that we rebuke other people because we love other people. So his way of thinking about it is much different than the way that the world presents it, and we ought to go with Jesus's instead of the world's. So we must rebuke, but when the rebuke is done and forgiveness is sought, then, notice, we must forgive. And forgiveness can be as hard, if not harder, than rebuking. I think it sometimes depends on the character of the person. Some people are quick to rebuke and slow to forgive. Some people are slow to rebuke. Wait. Some some people are quick to rebuke and slow to forgive, and some people are slow to rebuke and quick to forgive. I think I said that right. Well, yeah, we'll go with that. I think I got it wrong again. Some people are quick to rebuke and slow to forgive. Some people are slow to rebuke and quick to forgive. Okay, so you have the two opposite ends of the spectrum there, and I think it really depends on a person's nature. But both of these are commanded, both of them are important, and we need to do our best to implement both. A mature disciple will be able to do both of these. They're going to be able to rebuke in the hope that that rebuke is going to prick the heart of the sinner, and they will also freely forgive when the sin is put away, and they're going to rejoice at the restoration of their fellow disciple. They'll rebuke because they know they have to, they know they must, and they'll forgive because they love to do nothing better than forgiving someone. What's challenging, those aren't difficult commands to understand. It is challenging to apply them both, and I think even more challenging to apply them both with the right heart. Any base person can rebuke another person, but to rebuke another person without self-righteousness and with genuine love in your heart for the person that you're rebuking, that's another level of maturity, several layers deeper in maturity than the Christian who likes going around pointing out other people's sins, right? And to be able to couple loving rebuke with the love of forgiveness, that does take definitely a greater level of maturity. So a less mature Christian will fail usually on one end of the spectrum. They might fail to rebuke because they view it as unloving, or maybe they just don't really care that much about the condition of their sinful brother or sister. Or they might avoid rebuking altogether by justifying a person's sins. Changing the scriptures, coming up with new ways of looking at things that aren't proper so that they can justify some sin in their brother's life. So that's obviously a failing. They basically eliminate the need for any rebuke at all and tell everybody that they're fine. Right? That's one end and how people fail. Or they might love rebuking other people in their own self-righteousness, and they get no joy at all out of forgiveness. They love to see people in their sin so they can rebuke them and look down on them, but they don't necessarily love to see them come back and return to Christ, because then, well, they don't have anything to pick on anymore. And if you have ever been a part of a church for any length of time, you'll see people who are good in certain areas and people who are bad in certain areas, and people who are train wrecks and people who seem to have it all together. And so look for those mature Christians who can kind of show you the complete package and the proper heart behind all of these things. Jesus didn't want his disciples pursuing vengeance against other disciples who wronged them, even when those disciples who wronged them repeatedly. He says they're talking about forgiveness, that they ought to forgive their brother 7 times in a day if he comes asking for it. And I don't think that he meant that literally, like, you get 7 times and then you're up. I think what he's saying is you forgive your brother as many times as he comes to you, even if it's more times than you think is acceptable. I've heard, I haven't researched this to find out whether it's true or not, but I've heard that the Jews had a rule that you were supposed to forgive your brother like 2 or 3 times. And then after that, you were basically off the hook. You could just hate his guts after that. And Jesus says here that, no, if he comes to you 7 times in one day, you better forgive him every time. The language in verse 4 And if he sins against you 7 times in a day and turns to you 7 times saying, I repent, Jesus says, you must forgive him. He doesn't say, oh, it'd be nice if you would think about it. It'd be nice if you would consider it as still an option after 7 times. He said, you must do it. I think that's interesting. So to many people, including myself, my natural tendency would be to think if somebody failed 7 times, somebody offended me 7 times in one day, I would be pretty hesitant to forgive them. I might even think it was virtuous of me not to forgive them. You ever heard somebody say, well, you need to stand up for yourself. You need to demand your rights. You can't let people walk over you like this. And while there may be some truth to that in certain scenarios, I think that would probably be my attitude if somebody came to me 7 times, having made the same mistake and was asking for forgiveness. To many people, just human nature, this command seems outrageous. Certainly no one should have to forgive somebody that many times, right? But for those of us who know Jesus, that know of his sacrifice on the cross, know of the good news of the gospel, which, Jesus' apostles didn't fully understand at this point, but they eventually would, and those of us who have a recognition of our own sinfulness, this command actually makes perfect sense, because it's what we hope that God will give us. I mean, there have been times in my life where I've gone to God in one day and asked for forgiveness more than 7 times. Like, been some rough days. and the last thing that I want to hear from God is to say, oh, nope, you're done. You hit your quota for the day after that 3rd time or whatever. I'm going to stop forgiving you. Like, I've had enough of you. You're on my nerves, and I'm just going to hate your guts from now on. Like, that's not what we want to hear from God. We want God to extend grace to us no matter how many times in our life we have to come to him and ask for forgiveness. So why would we do anything different to somebody who came up to us and asked for forgiveness that many times if they genuinely were seeking that forgiveness, if their heart was genuine in it? I mean, how dare we? It's almost an outrage if we can't forgive, but then we expect God to forgive, almost as if we are, it was a greater thing for that person to offend us 7 times than it is for us to offend God 7 times. If he can still forgive after 7, then we better be able to forgive after 7. So while this seems almost outrageous to forgive somebody this many times for the same mistake, when we look at what God does for us on a daily basis, and if we have an understanding of our own heart and our own failings, I mean, this makes perfect sense to be this forgiving. So the idea of being told that we must forgive in verse 4 is, if you find that offensive, then maybe you need to spend a little bit more time meditating on Jesus' sacrifice. When you realize how much you've been forgiven, you'll love forgiving other people. You'll love being able to extend the grace given to you to another. And admittedly, there are plenty of times when that isn't the feeling in my heart when somebody does me wrong. But again, it's a level of Christian maturity that we have to reach, and I don't think I'm there on this issue as much as I need to be. Verse 5 through 6. Because vengeance is our natural tendency. I mean, it's absolutely my natural tendency. Verse 5 and 6. The apostle said to the Lord, increase our faith. And the Lord said, if you had faith like a grain of mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Well, as we mentioned, forgiveness is no easy task, and the apostles recognized that they were going to need some help if they were going to live out Jesus' instructions. So they asked Jesus for an increase in faith. His response was kind of interesting. He seemed to think that quality was the way that they needed to think about faith as a better metric than quantity. Because they said, increase our faith, and Jesus says, well, if you just had a tiny bit, like a grain of mustard seed, if you had genuine faith like that, it would be so powerful that you would be able to do wonders. He talks about rooting up a tree and planting it in the sea. And mustard seed, I think we've talked about this already in this study, but mustard seed is a really, really, really tiny seed. You can still buy it in the store if you go to the spice aisle. It comes in those little McCormick jars or whatever that spice company's called. And they're little tiny things. And there's a picture of them in the notes on page 113. So he said if you had just, that much, one mustard seed size of genuine faith, you would be fine. Faith is trust in the power of God, in God's sufficiency, and his ability to do things. So it isn't an issue of quantity that we accumulate. It's an issue of the depth of that trust. A person who has genuine faith, like Jesus talked about, can be used by God in powerful ways. Now, back in these days, in the first century, God was empowering people with supernatural ability and miraculous power, and they were doing all kinds of things. And although we don't necessarily see that today, there's no question that God still uses people of faith in great ways in the kingdom to accomplish great things through his power and sufficiency. Verse 7. Will any one of you who has a servant plowing or keeping sheep say to him when he has come in from the field, "Come at once and recline at table"? Will he not rather say to him, "Prepare supper for me, and dress properly, and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterwards you will eat and drink"? Does he thank the servant because he did what was commanded? If I could ever turn my page here. Verse 10, so you also, when you have done all that you were commanded, say, "We are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty." How should God's servants think of themselves and the work that they accomplish? Perhaps they accomplish something great on account of their genuine faith in God's power, like we just talked about in verse 6. How should they feel about themselves? There's definitely a temptation that when we accomplish things, we can become proud. We can want people's admiration for what we've accomplished. You can look back at our work and think, well, I'm really something for accomplishing this. We want others to admire it, and we want others sometimes to praise us for it. And this love of praise had taken hold of many in the Jewish religious community. They did their good deeds because men praised them for doing them. They worshiped publicly because people honored them for their devotion. They made a show of basically everything that they did, and it wasn't for God. It wasn't like God was going to miss what they were doing. It was for all the people around them, so they didn't miss it. I think they wanted and they expected the Messiah to honor them in the same way, say, to come down to earth and be like, "Oh man, you guys are just the most religious. You're the best." That's obviously not what they got. Jesus told his disciples, though, that they shouldn't think of themselves that way. They shouldn't think of themselves as worthy of honor for working for the Lord. He wanted them to think of themselves as servants in a great man's house. If you're a servant in a rich guy's house, the master of the house doesn't serve you dinner just because you put in a hard day's work in the field. Jesus is saying, no, the servants are still expected to serve until their day is up. So the master comes in from whatever he was doing, lounging and eating grapes outside in the sun, and he doesn't sit his servants down and say, "Oh, you've done such great work today. I honor you, and I'm going to serve you dinner." No, what does he expect? He expects his servants to come in, to change, to get cleaned up, and then to serve him dinner. And after that, they can eat. That's the role of a servant. And doing that job doesn't merit some kind of special honor or special praise. It's just what's expected of the role of a servant. So in the same way, disciples aren't to walk around seeking praise and honor for their service to God. Serving God is the only reasonable response that a human being has when they learn how much God has done for them. When they learn that God is sovereign and that he's the creator and that we are not. So We owe him our allegiance. God's the king, and we're his servants. Kind of like you think about like, well, never mind. So it's service is the expectation. So we shouldn't have the attitude that God owes us or that men owe us recognition for our work. As Jesus said, our attitude needs to be, quote, "We are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty." So we've only done our job. Now, what's incredible, though, about being a servant of God is that we serve a very gracious and generous master. And although we are not worthy of it, God has given us promises that we will be rewarded above and beyond anything that we deserve if we faithfully serve him. So that's the grace that we talk about when we think about heaven, when we think about being the adopted children of God. Yes, we are servants, and Jesus doesn't want us to puff ourselves up in self-righteousness and to think more of ourselves than we should. But then he tells us that our God loves us a great deal and wants to reward us for serving him, just out of the generosity of his heart. People often define grace as unmerited favor, unmerited blessing, and that's what we're promised if we serve, even though we're not worthy. An application. While we're here on earth, we need to remember that we aren't anything special. That's hard to remember because the world pushes that message that we're really something. But we shouldn't think of ourselves and our service to God as a means of promoting ourselves. We need to stay humble. We need to let God deal with the promotions. Let's see, where do I want to finish this up today? Oh, okay, we'll end in verse 20. So just we're going to talk about some men with leprosy and their interaction with Jesus. Verse 11 through 13. On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee, and he entered a village, and he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance, and lifting up their voices, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." Jesus was headed to Jerusalem, and he was met by 10 men with leprosy. Now, leprosy, I can't remember if we've talked about this already, but it used to be known as, or the more modern name for it is Hansen's disease. It's caused by a bacterial infection that attacks the nerves, and the bacteria is really slow acting, and some people can have the infection for years and years and not even know it. The bacteria causes like skin deformities and nerve damage, and if it goes untreated, people often lose their fingers and their toes because they lose feeling in them, and then they can't tell if they're being damaged or they're stepping on something that they shouldn't, or their people's noses and their skin often decays and falls off, and it's pretty horrible disease. There's also a loss of vision that is associated with it. Treatment for leprosy was developed in the 1940s by way of antibiotics, but back in this day there was no cure for it. According to the old Jewish law, the law of Moses, a person that was diagnosed with leprosy was considered to be unclean, and they weren't allowed to associate with their clean countrymen or the other Jews. And really, they were outcast not only from the Jewish society, but I think from pretty much every society, because people had at least a rudimentary understanding that this was a contagious thing. Leviticus chapter 3, or Leviticus 13, verse 3 says, "And the priest shall examine the diseased area of the skin of his body, and if the hair in the diseased area has turned white, and the disease appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a case of leprous disease. When the priest has examined him, he shall pronounce him unclean." So this explains why the lepers were standing at a distance from Jesus. It's because they weren't supposed to go up to healthy people. And so they're yelling from a ways away. Now, there was a leper. I think it was when Jesus was coming down from the Sermon on the Mount. This leper runs up to him and asks for cleansing. And Jesus was surrounded by a bunch of crowds. That probably would have caused quite a stir. But these guys are they're social distancing. How about that? This is a biblical first biblical example of social distancing. Maybe not the first, but okay. Verse 14. And when he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And they went, and as they went, they were cleansed. Jesus had compassion on these men, and he told them to make their way to the priests, implying that they would be healed. The Old Testament law also had some instructions for what a person was to do if they were healed from leprosy, which is kind of interesting because there was no known cure, but there were some miraculous healings. And from what I understand, that leprosy could actually refer to several types of a skin disease. So maybe there were some that eventually cleared up. I'm not exactly sure about that, but either way, there were some rules for what a person was supposed to do if they thought they had been cured, and they were supposed to go to the priests, and that's what Jesus is alluding to when he tells them to go and to show themselves to the priests here. You can read about that process in Leviticus chapter 14. Okay, verse 15 through 19. Then one of them, when he saw that he had been healed, he turned back, praising God with a loud voice. And he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan. And then Jesus answered, "Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and to give praise to God except this foreigner?" And he said to him, "Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well." After being healed, only one of the 10 returned to Jesus and thanked him. And the text makes a point to point out that this man was a Samaritan who the Jews didn't really like. And he fell at Jesus' feet and he praised God for his healing. And if you want to know more about the tensions between the Samaritans and the Jews, I have a video on my channel. You can search for it. It's entitled, "Why Did the Jews Hate the Samaritans?" The thumbnail for it's like red and yellow. It's kind of hard to miss. It doesn't really look like any of my other thumbnails, but it's proven to be a somewhat popular video. So the Jews didn't think very highly of the Samaritans, and I think that's important to recognize because Jesus' disciples and his followers here probably learned a little bit of a lesson, or hopefully they did. The Jews often avoided the Samaritans. They didn't even travel through their country. They spoke negatively of them, and there were some legitimate reasons for that because they practiced a false religion, but a lot of it seemed like it was prejudice that Jesus didn't share and he didn't approve of. And we see that he has a couple different interactions with Samaritans and with Gentile people, and he is very of the ones that he talks to and that are highlighted in the Gospels, he speaks very highly of them. So he didn't want the Jews to continue to think the way that they had been thinking about foreigners. Let's see. In verse 18, it seems implied that some, if not all, of the other 9 were actually Jews, because Jesus says, he specifically says there that has only this foreigner come back to thank me? And I think obviously implied would be that the others weren't foreigners, and you would think that they would be back to thank God and the Messiah for what he had done, but no, it's the Samaritan who returns, which is interesting. He was the only one that had the right mindset, the thankful mindset. And the miracle was a great display of Jesus' power over sickness. You think about the virus that we're going through now. People avoid other people. They put their masks up because when they're around other people because they could be made sick by that other person. Their disease could affect them. And that's kind of the way that we have to operate in our world. We as humans are susceptible to disease, and it can destroy us if it's bad enough. But Jesus is quite the opposite. He's the cure. He cannot be destroyed by the disease. He destroys the disease. He fixes what is wrong. rather than feels threatened by what is wrong. And I think that's a beautiful image of just Jesus in general, as the fixer of all of the problems that human beings are susceptible to, whether that's physical disease or whether it's sin. Let's see where. Sorry, I'm going off my notes a little bit. I probably shouldn't, but now I'm trying to figure out what I was talking about in the first place. So it was a great display of Jesus' power over sickness, but it was also an important lesson for Jesus' Jewish disciples. A lot of the Jews had the idea that they were particularly special and they were particularly approved of by God because of their ancestral line, because they came from that nation that God had selected as being his people. But here Jesus revealed that it's the heart that matters, not the genetics. Sometimes the greatest examples of faith were to be found and are to be found outside. Sometimes the greatest examples of faith are to be found outside. Sorry, that's past tense. Sometimes the greatest examples of faith were to be found outside of the Jewish community. And that probably would have been pretty shocking. This is a lesson that I think the Jews had to learn more than once, and Jesus teaches it to them more than once, because they had to shift their minds from thinking that it was just the Jews who God loved, and just the Jews who had something to teach them about the way that they should, about religion, about spiritual things. So a few applications here as we close out this first section of chapter 17. Number one, pictures of godliness don't always show up where we might expect them. Sometimes the best teachers are the unexpected ones. And I know that this has been true in my life. I've seen this. I've discounted people and what they have to teach me, and I've been proven wrong a number of times. that people who you don't expect to show you pictures of Christ, a lot of times they will, and if our minds are open to seeing it, they have a lot to teach us. So it's the don't judge the book by its cover lesson, but apply that to spiritual things and where you may see the best images of Jesus. It's in the humble people, and I think a lot of times I expect to see it in the great people, even though Jesus has told me not to do that a million times. It's human nature to do that. So I go looking at these people who are highly admired, highly honored, and I'm like, okay, show me Christ. But the best lessons I've learned about Jesus are sometimes in the most humble people, of whom the world doesn't ascribe very much significance, and even the church sometimes doesn't ascribe a great deal of significance. Application number two, godliness is not inherited or granted to a person because they were born into a particular pedigree. A proper attitude towards God is cultivated in the heart of an individual. And then finally, when God blesses us, we should take the time to thank him. And this is like that's not a complicated application. It's not hard to understand, but it is something we forget to do a lot of times. I mean, how many times have you prayed for something, you've really been in need, you've prayed earnestly about it, something that was weighing heavy on your heart, and then when God gave it to you and he answered your prayer positively, you just didn't even think to go back and thank him. I know I do that. I have been getting better since I've been learning this application from the Gospels, but still, a lot of times we just don't take the time to give thanks. So we should. All right. This situation reveals that God does care if we come back to him and give thanks. Right? That's something that he takes note of, and he also takes note if we don't do it. So think about that as well. All right, that is the first half of chapter 17, and we will do, Lord willing, the next half. I'm actually planning on recording that right after this one, so hopefully it will be released a day after this one. All right, you guys have an excellent day. I hope those of you who are in the cold weather are staying out of the snowstorms. I've seen some pretty brutal temperatures back home in Ohio, which I will be headed back to Ohio here in a couple well, the end of the week. So, yes, hopefully the weather isn't terrible. But, and if you're on a nice balmy island, like in Guam, I hope you have a good day as well. All right, I'll stop rambling. See you guys later.